First things first, we're going to want some trees if we're going to make a forest. So I've made a couple of trees for this tutorial, and you can get them from my Gumroad. I'll put the link in the description. They're set up with Arnold shaders and so on, so they should be good to go if you're using them in Maya. If you're using them in a different app, you could set it up yourself. But anyway, this is going to be for Maya. So basically, what we want is we want to grab a tree and have it shaded in Arnold like so. And add a couple modifications to it and then export it as an AS file so it can be loaded in as a stand-in like this one on the left. I'll show you how to do that. But the first thing to talk about is how it's shaded. So if I open up the shading network, I'll show you I've added a color jitter to the diffuse map. So it's going to create some variation when it gets scattered. So it's not all going to be the same color. So to set this up so it works with stand-ins, you're going to want to change the type to procedural. And then just dial in some very small numbers. So I've got a bit of saturation, a bit of hue, and so on. Like I said, this will be in the Gumroad file if you want to use that. But if you're setting this up yourself with your own trees or whatever, just go ahead and use these kind of values. And that should be good to go. So remember procedural. And then when we go ahead to export this as a stand-in, we'll grab all the bits of geometry, go to Arnold, go to stand-in, export stand-in, click the little box there, and then we want all these selected. Make sure you have all shading groups exported, then export the selection, come up with a dialog. You want to save this as an AS file, okay? And then once you've got this exported wherever you save it to, you can load it back in by just creating Arnold create stand-in, which will create one of these boxes. It will be a small bounding box when you start with, and then when you load in the file, I'll show you. I've loaded in this pine tree that I've just created. I've loaded it in as a stand-in here, and in order to make sure that this works in MASH, a couple of things. So we've got that procedural set up in the color jitter node, but we also want to go down to Arnold procedural settings, and we want to turn off auto instancing, and then that will enable the color jitter to create different variations per instance. So that should work. So that's how we get our stand-ins. So that's the first part sorted. So in a new instance of Maya, let's create a ground plane. Make sure you set up your project and everything and so on. And so polymodeling, drop a plane down. We want it to be pretty big, so I'm going to just scale this up to maybe 2,000 units. So it's pretty massive. Probably could go a bit smaller, but whatever. We'll just go this and see how we get on. Now the key thing is with this is just we want to create some nice variation for the trees to sit on, some peaks and valleys and so on. So I'm just going to increase the subdivisions on this to maybe 40. So we've got a little bit of information to work with. And then just use the sculpting tools, go to the sculpt and grab the first one. And you can see you can put some shapes in there. You've got control of the brush. You hold down B, increase or decrease your brush size. If you double click on this icon on the left here, you can control the size and the strength using that as well. So what you want to do is just create some peaks and troughs really. This is just where you're going to get some sort of mountainous regions or whatever. This will just make it feel a bit, obviously you don't want to have your trees just on a flat plane. This will just create a more natural looking shot, and you can build this up a bit however you like, and then once you've got it to a certain level, just start playing around with where you think you might put your camera. Somewhere where you can maybe pull off a camera move coming up and revealing or whatever. So work into this for a bit, and then once we've got a nice sort of landscape, we can just start scattering. So this is the ground plane that I've come up with. As you can see, there's some sort of dips in the ground there, create some nice sort of valleys and so on. And what I've done is I've just stuck a camera here, and I've animated it so it's just revealing the shot a little bit, and there'll just be loads of trees here in the foreground and whatever, and just reveal a sort of a larger forest beyond. So I'm not going to go into the camera animation here. You can, just put a couple keys down and just animate it going to and fro or whatever. So from this sort of point, we want to import our stand-ins. So the first thing you want to do is just go to Arnold and create your stand-ins. So create stand-in and open up your attribute editor. Grab the path. I've put mine in my library. So these are the trees. Grab the hash file there. And I'm going to duplicate that. Control D. Hit Control F. I'll hit F there as well. So zoomed in. And we're just going to load in the other tree, the broadleaf. So that's the two trees. So to set up the MASH network, the first thing you want to do is just select one of your trees, and I suggest actually at this point just quickly name them. So this one's pine, and the other one is broadleaf, just so you know which is which. Now grab the first one, the pine, and then go over to the MASH tab, and just hit this MASH icon here. And this will create a MASH network. You see, our tree there's disappeared. It just gets hidden. If I open up the outliner, it's been hidden. So if you hit Shift H, it will unhide it again. And then you can see a series of instances of that pine have been put on the origin. So if we open up the MASH options, which is this icon here, just open. So we get this, and then we open the attribute editor as well, so Control A. If you click on the distribute, actually we'll need the outliner as well, so grab the outliner. Now, I've just labelled my ground plane just ground. This makes it easy to find. And we want to change our MASH distribute to mesh. So it distributes these instances on a mesh. If you middle mouse click this ground and drag it over to input mesh, we get the initial instances. They're now on our mesh, on our ground plane, that is. Obviously not enough, so first thing we'll do is we'll increase this to maybe 50,000. So that's quite a lot, and it's slowing down the viewport a bit. It's a bit annoying. You would expect with stand-ins that it would be quite quick, but for some reason with MASH doing this method, it's a bit slower in the viewport. So when you're working with it, sometimes it's probably better to, until you start rendering at least, maybe drop in the number. So we've got about 5,000, and that's enough that this will run smoothly. And to add the other tree to that, we want to actually, that's something that's reminded me. So my MASH is already set up to, when I create a MASH, it will default to creating a MASH instance. So as you can see here in the outliner, if yours hasn't, if it defaults to MASH repro, I think is the other version, you can change that if you go over to, is it MASH? Let's have a look. If I go to change from modeling to FX, I think, yeah. So be in the FX tab, there's a MASH thing here. If you go to utilities, it will be, or yeah, no, I think it is here. Where is it? Ah, yeah, switch MASH geometry type. So you want to just, if yours is a repo, I think there's the other type, switch it over to be an instance. So that's the one you want, and that's the one we're using. So back onto adding MASH nodes. In our attribute editor, we have a bunch here, and you can also select them from the MASH editor, but this is nice and big, so we'll use this. We want to create some variation, which we'll do in a second, but we want to add our second tree first. So select the broadleaf in the outliner, and then select the instancer, and you can see the object list here. We've already got the pine, so let's just add selection, the broadleaf. So we've got the pine and the broadleaf, and then in order for the broadleaf to be loaded, we need to select the MASH again and go to ID, add an ID node, and just change the ID type. Linear is probably fine, but we'll just change it to random, and count is 2. So we've got 2 instances loaded in, so you only need 2 IDs. If you had more trees loaded in, let's say 6, you would make the ID count 6. So that's given us some variation. And then to really properly add some shape and size variation, we'll add a random node. So let's click on that, add random node. The first thing we want to do is do some scale. So just turn on uniform scale so we don't have to do each one, and just increase the scale to maybe 0.6 maybe, to have some larger trees and smaller trees. You'll notice that MASH at the moment, it's not reflecting this. It looks like there's trees on top of trees, but that's a glitch with MASH. It should be fine in rendering. The next thing we want to do is just create some angle jitter. So the first thing is go to rotation Y and change it all the way to 360, and you'll see that annoyingly that some of them are following the normals and they've just rotated downwards. So what we're going to need to do is go back into the distribute and change the setting here, calculate rotation, turn that off. So they're all pointing up now, because naturally trees they go towards the light, so they may be influenced by the hill somewhat, grow outwards or whatever, but they won't be growing completely sideways. And we can add that in the random node. So if we go to rotation X and just add a little bit, you can see they're starting to lean. If we add a bit of rotation Z, just a little bit to create that. So the rotation Y, that makes sure that there's lots of on the Y-axis rotation, so you get different sides of the tree. So that's good to go for the initial setup of the MASH. So what you probably want to do now is just get your first sort of test renders out. Before we do that, probably a good idea to apply a texture to your ground plane. Anything will do really, just a sort of dirt texture. I've grabbed one from, I think it was Texture Haven, that's the one. What one have I used? It's one of the aerials. It's an aerial rocks diffuse texture. I've just put it on, and as it's a huge 2000 units, I've just repeated this by 15. And when you're loading these textures in order to, if you want to, make things easy on yourself, like here, have this Place 2D to control all of the different textures, the normal map, and the diffuse and so on. Just middle mouse click this control. Yeah, it's control. Middle mouse click the yellow dot to the subsequent one on the diffuse. Just do that to each of them, and you can control them with one. Place 2D. I'll put a link in the description of Texture Haven so you know where you can get these from. So just so that the trees have got a kind of an appropriately coloured backdrop. So your initial lighting, you'll want a sky dome, which I've dropped one in, and again HDRI Haven. I'll put the link in the description. I've just grabbed one as the sort of to flood this scene, give us a bit of ambient light. And then because you want some sun to pick up the subsurface that the trees have got, put in a directional light as well, and it's just pointing sort of a low sunny direction. So if I go and look through the camera, you see like it should get some sort of like backlight on the trees. So let's go ahead and do a test render. And it's not working, probably in the wrong render layer. So let's grab, we'll get back to the render layers in a second. Okay, so there you go. So with very few trees, not enough, the directional light is sort of bleaching out the ground plane. But you can see the trees are rendering, so that's fine. And it's just worth noting a couple of things. What I've done here with the directional is I've pumped up the exposure, the Arnold exposure to 5, which is quite high, and I've dropped the color temperature down to 5000, make it a bit warmer. That's why it's bleaching out. Now remember, what I said about the Arnold procedural settings auto instancing off, so in case you're not getting any color variation. So if we just have a quick look at that render, you can see there's some sort of more yellowy trees and some slightly more green, and that's the color jitter kicking in. So that's pretty good. So that's the basics of how you get the a setup scattering with MASH. It's really quite quick and easy to do. So setting this up for rendering, the first thing you're going to want to do is just really crank up the amount. So if we go to the distribute, 5,000 is nowhere near enough. We're probably going to need closer to 100,000, I would say. The render that I've done with this before was about that, I think. It's 10,000, 100,000, which will be slow on the viewport. So make sure when you're doing a render of this, when you're doing animation, sorry, you want to sort of either hide these. You can hide the instancer. Just select the instancer and Control H to hide it. Then you can do all your animation really quickly. But where it's visible, it will slow down your viewport a lot. So it's just a quick test render with this. So there's a lot more trees. There's still a few patches that aren't covered, but I don't think that's not too bad. It's probably just about enough, depending on how you laid out your scene and depending on the scale of trees as well, because you could potentially scale up the trees. So it comes down to the shot you're making really. But if you're following along, then I would just say that the trees I'm using, I've left them as the default size. But again, you can play around with the scale, see what works. So the way that the fog is set up is exactly the same as how we've set up the trees, basically. So the way to set it up here is, let's hide our horrendously slow trees. Let's hide these. So you want the clouds to sort of sit on a plane amongst these trees. So let's create another ground plane and scale it up. Same size, so 2,000 units. And just drop it on top of our ground plane. Maybe move it up a little bit so it's easy to select. Now you want this to be not renderable, so open up the attributes, go to Arnold and turn off all of the render raw attributes so it's not renderable, and give it a name like cloud scatter. So now we're going to use the same methods here. We're going to create another MASH, but we'll need some clouds to scatter. Now I'm going to use some VDB clouds that I've made in Houdini. I'll make these available on my Gumroad as well, and the link will be in the description. So the way to load these, you just go to Arnold, volume, and get a little volume square, and just load one of the clouds. I've got 4 of them in this little collection. So cloud A. If I hit F on the keyboard, get a bit closer, you can see it sort of loaded this shape. I'm going to duplicate that, and I'll just go ahead and I'll load the other clouds. I'm going to move them off to the side like I did with the trees. So just move them over so they're not in the way of the shot. Whoops, not that. Let's deselect them. So our clouds, I think we're probably going to want to scale this up a little bit, so because they're quite small, I'll probably scale them up by 10, maybe a bit less, maybe 5. We'll add scale of variation in the MASH anyway. So select the first one and go back to the MASH tab, hit the MASH button. Once again, it's hidden it. Just like to keep them unhidden so I know where it is. Volume. And then we're going to want to do the same thing. So you see the second MASH here, MASH 2. Probably a good idea to name these, but whatever. Let's grab the second MASH, change the type to mesh again, get the outliner up, and let's bring the cloud scatter, middle mouse, click and drag, and we've got the cloud scatter now. That should, yeah, we can see there's a couple little clouds there. So same method as before to add the other clouds. So go to the outliner, grab the clouds first. So just grab all the volumes, grab the instancer, click add selection, and we've got all the volumes. Now there's 4 of them this time. So if we go to MASH, you want to go to ID, add another ID node. Let's click ID, didn't go to it. And we've got 4. You see it's done at 4 now. So let's click random again. Let's do the same what we've done with the trees, add some variation. So back to the home, press random, add a random node, and then we're going to just do 180 degrees random wire rotation. Actually, there's not enough to see, so let's just pump up the amount we've got. Say 5,000. Yeah, that's fine. So in the random, we'll turn on the uniform scale. We'll scale them up quite big. You know, we want a lot of big clouds here, because we're going to make them quite wispy shading wise, and also position wise. We want some variation on the y-axis because our scatter plane's flat, but we don't want the clouds to be perfectly flat on a singular plane. We want them to be there are a lot of variation. So maybe crank this up to 100, maybe a bit less, maybe 50, depending on what looks good. And actually, the only way to judge that is to render it. So once we've got this initial layout of clouds, we'll want to just give it a shader. So let's open up the Hypershade, go to shaders and standard volume, and we'll just call this cloud. Just minimize this to the side. Now if we grab the outliner and just drop this onto our volumes, should label these as well, but I'm being lazy. Right, so assign these to the cloud, and because we want it to be wispy cloud, this is there's a good amount of density. I made these clouds in Houdini, so there's a bit of density breakup in there, but we want it to be really wispy. So probably 0.02 is a good starting point for the density. And let's go ahead and go to our render camera and just see what's going on. Still probably too dense actually. So let's open up. I'm going to leave this open rendering in the IPR and just open up the cloud shader again and drop that to 0.01. Might take. Oh, it's not. If you click the play button to update it, still too much, I'd say. 0.001. Yeah, that's kind of what I had in mind more. So what I'll do now is I'll unhide the trees and render it on top of the trees just to see what that looks like, and then we'll go into rendering. So let's go and unhide the tree instance. So this might take a minute to render now because there's a lot of instances being loaded. So let's just render these and see what happens. Yeah, it's nearly there really. Probably want to drop the density just a little bit more. It's so dense you can't see through to the ground there, but depending on the look you want, maybe that's fine. Or it'd be a bit more wispy than that. So I'm going to go back into the shader and I'm going to go even lower, so 0.0005. Oh, is that? Yeah. One other thing that can work is if you go down to transparency, you can increase the transparency weight, so I might crank that up. Yeah, something like that. Play around with the shader and see if you get what you like. It's just about creating this sort of foggy environment, atmosphere. You can also try using the environment atmosphere and environment fog settings in the renderer, but using these VDBs you can control things a bit more. So something like that, it looks okay. So coming to render this, it's going to be quite a long render. I've rendered this scene obviously already, so it was quite a long render, and I've got a 16-core machine. So depending on how strong your machine is, you'll want to do a few things to speed it up. So the first thing is that when I rendered it with sort of draft samples, and that was one thing. So if you go to Arnold Render, I actually left these all default. Now to get a cleaner render you'll want to crank this up a bit, but it's already slow, and that's because of the subsurface. So there's a few things I'd suggest. One is the subsurface on the trees. Depending depending on your lighting setup and what you want to get, because you get this nice sort of backscatter effect with the subsurface, you could potentially turn that off. That would speed things up a lot. So that's one way to get a much faster render. Or you could do what I've done, which is sort of draft samples and then denoise in post. Now I've done a bit of a hacky denoise, so I've rendered out the comp and then gone into DaVinci Resolve and denoised in there using the denoiser there. One other thing you can do in Maya, which would probably give you a cleaner result, is you've got the Arnold denoise AOVs. If we go to the AOVs, open up denoiser, if you click output denoising AOVs, it will add those. You can use those to denoise it in post. So I won't go into it in this tutorial. It's out there, you know, the information's out there probably on the Arnold docs, but that's one way to get a cleaner result. So either dial back the subsurface, or you know, do a draft version with denoising AOVs. Those are two ways to get a sort of a better, quicker render. Because if you're rendering this on like a quad-core machine, this will probably take a few days. I think on my machine, it's a Ryzen machine, it took about 28 hours to get 100 frames, which is, it's not too bad, but it is quite long if you compare that to what a GPU renderer can do. So that's enough waffle about rendering. Let's set up how we're going to render this in layers. Let's take a look. So let's create two layers. One, just label it trees, and the other one fog. And actually I'll call this trees underscore beauty. And in this you want to just create a collection which is geo, and you collect all of your geo, so the trees, the ground, and the trees scatter. And you can see I've already set up here is a set. So if you, with these selected, if you go to create set, it will create a set here, and in the set you've got some extra attributes which we'll use. So you go to Arnold in the set, and you've got Arnold overrides. You can click add, and you get a whole list of them. And the one I add is AI matte. Just type an AI capital M, press enter. It's not visible because I've already added it, but it'll be visible. Add that, and there's a glitch in Maya as usual. It's not showing it here. Normally it shows it in the attributes, but it should be shown in the extra attributes as well. So we'll use that in the fog layer. Just so that's ready, that's set up. And then selecting the geo group, if we change our layer, so we're looking at this red layer, there's nothing. But then if we add geo, it's here. And I can't see our instance. The instance has not been added to our set, so I'll add that. Should take a second. There you go. So if we just do a quick test render, we should just get the trees without the fog. So let's have a look. So yeah, trees without fog, that's fine. And then let's just quickly go over the AOVs I've added for this. It's quite simple. I've just put a depth and crypto. So this is just so I can sort of meddle around with the colours of the trees in post, and the depth just so we can create a bit of, you know, either depth of field or some extra fog in comp. There's a few more you could add, but let's keep it simple. These two, and like I said, denoising AOVs is a good idea. I'm not going to do it because I've already done my crappy cheat way of doing it. So that's that render layer, and you want to turn off, by the way, this icon here. You turn that off for the master layer because we don't want to render the master layer. And then the fog layer, we want to create another collection. Just call it fog, and you want to add your fog and the MASH instance, so the second one with the fog on it. So and also you want to add, well, you won't add that actually. So you add these ones like this, but there's no ground plane, so we need that, and we need the trees to be like a holdout, a matte for the fog. So to do that, go back to our set, and you'll see we've got that AI matte that we created here. Now if we right click on this and create absolute override for visible layer, it will go orange, and that will add this. So it's added it, you can see it. Now turn it on. So now all the geometry we've added will be a matte. But one thing you must do for this to work with Arnold stand-ins is go to one of them, so the broadleaf for example. It will not work as a matte until you go to stand-in overrides and turn on override matte. So make sure you do that with each of the trees, or as many trees as you've done. They have to have that turned on. And then now that everything's enabled in this layer and you've got that matte, if we render this, we'll get the fog on the trees, and the trees will be a black holdout. So you can see you've got that masked. So then when we come to comping it, just put it on the top, and it should work nicely. So that's just about it for rendering. With these two render layers set up, it's going to render a lot quicker than rendering them as one render layer, basically. So the final thing is just to go over a couple of the Arnold settings. So like I said, leaving this as a draft, so if you want a nicer render, crank up those settings there. I think I increased the ray depth of diffuse bounces to 2. That probably slow it down, so again, think about that if you want it to be faster. I've set it to be a 1080p render. Again, that would be maybe a bit slower. Could drop the res. Make sure you set up your camera. So I've got my render cam set up there. Frame range set up, and then there's a number of things you want for your EXR settings. So you want it to be a zips, compression, half precision, turn off tiled because that speeds it up in Nuke and Fusion, auto crop in case you're using Nuke, and merge the AOVs so that you get them all in a single EXR. So that's your basic render settings done. Got the AOVs. The only thing that's left to do is to go to the rendering tab and go to render sequence, click the box there. It will come up with this. Make sure the camera's selected, all render layers enabled, so we've got just these two, render sequence, and then depending on how powerful your system is, in a day you might have a result, or if you've got a Threadripper, maybe a lot quicker. Okay, so this is the Fusion comp that I've set up. So if you're doing this in Nuke, a lot of this is applicable and vice versa. We're just going to do it in Fusion. I'll quickly go over what I've done, and then we'll build a basic comp with the renders. So what I've gone ahead with here is I've got the tree beauty, which is this one, and actually I mistakenly rendered this with tiling turned on in the EXR settings, so it's actually a bit slower than it should be. If you've done what I did, which in the previous part, which is turn it off, it should be faster. So we've got the fog and the trees. Now, first thing you need to do in Fusion, don't need to do this in Nuke, is color management. So you want to put a gamut on to bring it into the right color space. So the gamut is set to sRGB, and that just corrects the color space. Now the reason I've put an alpha divide node before both of those to bring it to correct color space is if you don't have a divide and multiply whenever you do any color manipulation. So you can see I've got color correct here, and I've got the gamut changing the color space. If you have no pre-mult and non-pre-mult, which is what these are, then your edges, your alpha edges will get ruined. So if I turn them off, you'll see Control P turns them off. You see, probably help if I show the end result. So let's turn these. Yeah, like what the heck. So make sure you have those when you're doing color corrections to both your layers. And then you see on the left here, I've got a Luma keyer here. This is picking up the depth, so it's set to channel depth. And because it's come from Arnold, for some reason Fusion thinks that the depth is inverted, so you have to choose the near plane is actually the far plane, and the far plane is actually the near plane, so just bear that in mind. And then you just want to pipe that into the channel booleans. You switch all of the channels to alpha foreground, which gives you this mask. Then if you pipe that into a bitmap, then you get the mask, and you get a bit more control with this. Now that that's piped in, you can control the strength of the alpha or whatever. So this is nice for adding an extra bit of fog. So if I show you, like, it's just a bit of environmental kind of fog that you would normally get on a large scale scene. And then once that color correct fog is added, I've added the real fog that we've rendered on top. So there's the fog that I rendered. this version I did, it was quite really weak on the shader, so it doesn't show up that much. And then the first thing to do to take the edge off, this is quite a noisy render, so I've put a little bit, look, tiny blur on there. I think it's 0.05 blur. You want to do that on CG renders just to take the edge off sometimes. And then to put a background here, what I've done is I've taken a HDRI. This is again from HDRI Haven, so just pick one that fits your scene. And I've exported the camera from the scene as an alembic, and then built a little 3D scene here, and that's enabled me to sort of project the background so that when the camera pans up, this sort of moves with it. You could do it in Maya and render it out separately, but this is just another way of doing it. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail in this tutorial about this. The main point of this is forests, but that's just something you could do. If you're interested in getting this set up, let me know in the comments. And then the rest, there's an Expo Glow, which some of these nodes are from the Fusion Reactor plugin, but most of them, you know, just color corrects and color curves. Like this one, Chroma Fuse, that's chromatic aberration. So if we zoom in, you can see it's just created some edge blur, or chromatic aberration and so on. And then film grain on top just to break it up a bit and make it look more organic. And I've created another bitmap here, taking the whole scene, taking the luminance for the scene, so here it is, and merging that on top, which has done nothing. Sometimes this looks quite interesting if you just oh, that's why I've forgotten it. There was actually a lens dirt added here, so it was going to merge in lens dirt in the highlights, but that's forgotten. And then I've got rays, which again, they're not really doing much, but they're just sort of spilling over the background. So they're generated separately from the highlights, and then I'm merging them back on top, and it's sort of spilling over some of the edges there. And then a hot spot on top of that is just again fill in the background with a bit of extra exposure. And then I've just done a couple more color corrects and merged in a background, which is actually it's a gradient, which is kind of a sunny color gradient. So that's all there is to it. It's not a hugely complex comp. And then I'm saving them out as a TGA. I've got another tutorial about how I'm doing this in Fusion, the steps I've been taking, and again how to like encode this. So I've encoded it as an MOV. So yeah, what I would say is if we're going to set this up, I'm using some of, I've got a plugin here from the Reactor which is letting me use nuke shortcuts. So if I hit R, it's loading in the render. So if I go to Forester 1, Tree Beauty, if you're not using the nuke shortcuts, then you can just hit Tab, I think, although that might also be a nuke shortcut. So if it's not that, it's Control Spacebar. Just so used to using nuke. So and then you can load in a loader, and then again fog. So that's the two layers, and they're not loading because they're being slow. So we'll add a couple more. Oh, here we go. So let's add the alpha divide on the tree, and then the gamma. Hit sRGB, and then alpha multiply, and that's sorted out the edges. And then we'll just copy that over, Control C V, that's for the other part, and then we'll do the luma key with the depth, change from luminance to depth, and then like I said, it's reversed, so the near plane is the far plane. So grab far away and then the near plane here, and then create channel booleans, Pipe that in. Change that to alpha foreground. Change each one to that. One. Okay, so it's that, and then we just want to create a bitmap. Pipe that into the bitmap, and now we can dial in our fog. So if I create a color correct now, use these, the blue ones are for masks. Then we can sort of drop the contrast a little bit, maybe create a bit of blue, simulate a hazy day. That's cool. And then create a merge node. I think the yellow one's background, green one's foreground. Always forget. If you pipe them in the wrong way around, you can just hit Control-T and swap them. So that's the first part of the comp. And then, like I said, if you go through and do your color corrections and so on, create a blur. If you want to make things like, if you don't have Reactor, I mean, it's free, so you can just go ahead and download it and get some of these nodes. But you know, things like the chroma fuse, you know, color to create chromatic aberration. If you just hit, if you create a transform node, pipe that in, and you scale the shot up by 0.05, maybe 0.1, let's make it, no, 0.01, so it's quite obvious, and then just change it so it's only affecting the red channel. Do the settings tab and just hit the red, or alternatively green, whatever. You just having the red is probably enough, and then just change that to 0.05 because it's a little bit too much. That's one easy way to just create chromatic aberration. I mean, it doesn't look quite as good as what the node is. I think the node has got a couple more nodes inside, but it's a basic way to do it. So yeah, that's the basic way to get these all comped. And like I said, if you're interested in getting the camera set up, let me know in the comments, because you may not necessarily need that if you're doing a still render or if you've done a slightly different camera angle. So, so yeah, that's pretty much it. How you get a forest made in Maya and Arnold, MASH, and comping it together in Fusion. So I hope that was helpful. And any questions or any requests on further topics, let me know in the comments below.